Hi, I'm Josh Bernoff, and I'm happy to be here on Phil's broadcast to talk about Build a Better Business Book.
And what's the best advice you ever got, Josh?
The best advice I ever got was early in my career. I worked with a writer, and he said, "Why are you writing everything in the passive voice?" And I was like, "Well, what does that mean?" And when I learned what the passive voice was and how it actually undermines your meaning, that that made a huge impression on me. So the best advice I ever got was, "Don't write in the passive voice."
Wow. So, how many years ago was that? Was it when you first started writing
It,
books,
that
or?
was that would have been in the 80s. So no,
Oh,
I started my career as a technical writer. I was writing software documentation, and this was another software writer who gave me the that advice. Yeah.
cool. Well, let's explain. What is the passive voice for those who are like, hey, what the heck is that? Is that some writing term? What are we doing here?
Okay, I'll be happy to explain that. So, uh, the passive voice sentence is a sentence in which the actor is not the subject of the sentence. So I'll give you an example. If we say uh, the the passenger was dragged off of the plane, then you don't really know who did the dragging. The passenger was obviously not the one who did that. And it's very common in business writing that people just write things without thinking about who's going to do it. Like, the budget must be carefully examined, and the problem with that is that people trying to take that advice, they look at that and they're like, well, am I supposed to do something here or not? Once you start to write those sentences in the active voice, that is, you say the CFO must examine the budget. You're like, oh, okay, well now I know who's supposed to do what. And I would say that 70% of the editing I do for books and for everything else is taking things out of the passive voice, and people are like, wow, that sounds so much better now. It's extremely simple, and they could have done it themselves.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, hopefully nobody's listening so they don't take that advice and they keep employing you, Josh. That's my hope.
uh, Believe me, I could work on this until the end of my days, and it would still be a problem that would not be solved. Uh,
That's funny.
yeah.
Well, that's a good reminder for me. I'm definitely going to listen to that and work
Mhm.
on no passive voice. That's good. So your book is, a better business book, which I love. I mean, when you
Mhm.
sent that to me and asked me to blurb, I'm like, okay, this is going to be really good because I love your writing. And I'm
Mhm.
like, okay. And then I read it, I'm like, man, I got a lot of work to do. I'm scared people are going to read my stuff. So tell me, was your goal to scare the hell out of people like me, or what was the goal of the book, Josh?
Well, I let me answer that in two ways. First of all, um, for over 15 years now, I have been working with authors, and the authors often ask the same questions over and over again. I'm like, oh, that's not how publishing works. No, that's not how you structure a book. No, that's not how you do a title. No, that's not what happens when you're doing a cover. No, that's not the right way to promote it. And I realized as I was saying these things over and over again, I was like, I should just write this all down, and then people would have a reference. And I wanted to put everything in there that somebody might ask. And that's why this is a comprehensive guide. And it's also why it's 70,000 words long. Um, the, the, One of my principles is that in a business book, the first chapter should be the scare the crap out of you chapter. And there are two ways to do that: fear and greed. Fear is, oh my gosh, if I don't do what they say here, I'm in trouble. And greed is, oh, if I do these things, then I'll make more money or be more successful. So, yes, I am intending to scare the crap out of people. I want them to read that first chapter of my book and say, oh man, I better do this right, or else if I do a book, it's just not gonna accomplish the goals I had for it.
Yeah. Well, it definitely did. I mean, like I said, I read that. I'm like, oh boy, okay, I got some rewriting to do. I don't know that I hit it in my last book, but I promise I'm going to hit it in the next one
uh,
because as I read the book, I'm like, oh man, like I'm not sure. So with that, you talk about kind of the stuff that people ask and build a better business book. So and you've been long time working with authors. So what's the biggest mistake that you see besides the passive voice there, Josh, when authors are trying to get a business book together?
well, I think the biggest mistake is that they don't understand what business books actually are.
Hmm.
Um, the first time I wrote a book proposal, At the time, I was an analyst at Forrester Research, and I wrote this proposal and I sent it to a very experienced book agent named Ike Williams. And he said, I can't sell this. And I said, why can't you sell it? It's got all sorts of stuff about the future and it's really important. People are going to want to read it. He said, listen, business books are made of stories and people. There are no people and there are no stories in here. It reads like a research report, which he was exactly right. It did. I was like, oh, I can do that. And that really is the thing that people don't understand. They don't understand that business books are made out of stories. You got to have stories. There are over 20 case studies in the book I just wrote, and that the book itself is a story, which is people have a problem. This is the nature of the problem. This is how they solve the problem. It's a narrative that takes you through from beginning to end. Even if it's a business book about strategy, it really is just a story about what people need to do and how they'll live happily ever after if they follow the advice.
Ooh, happily ever after. So yeah, so it was a dark and stormy night. That's how I'm going to start my next book. Is that right,
Well,
or how am I doing?
I think if it's a meteorology book, that would be excellent.
And I know nothing about meteorology, so that's probably not the way to start a
No,
business
no,
book,
no.
right?
It's a good idea to write a book about the things that you're actually expert in.
Yeah.
So
So,
yes.
so with that, right? So I talk to a lot of executives and a lot of folks that want to write a book, and they're like, "Well, I've got so much I could write about." So
Mhm.
how do we start with picking the topic or the thesis of the book, Josh?
Well, I think you want to think about your audience. I got a phone call a couple of days ago from a woman who it was clear that she didn't really understand what she wanted to do with her book. And I said, who's your audience? And she said, everybody. I'm like, oh God, please no. So that's the first step, is to think about who your audience is. Because if you're working with clients and they're all in the financial services industry, or they are all product managers, or they're all software engineers, or they're all entrepreneurs, they surely they have something in common. Even if it's just a bunch of people who feel like they have imposter syndrome, they have an issue. So that's the first piece, and then the second piece is, what's the problem you're going to solve for them, right? So my book, the problem is, how do I write a business book and have it be effective? But every business book has to have a problem that it solves. The problem is, strategy has to be different because of the metaverse, or the problem is, advertising is getting more and more expensive and less effective, or the problem is there are 1,000 entrepreneurs all chasing the same venture capital money and you need to stand out. But that question is what you need to look at, and that tells you what goes in and what goes out. So if you're writing about entrepreneurs chasing venture money, then you don't write about hiring, let's say, unless that's relevant to raising the venture money. So focus on the audience and the problem, and then you know what belongs in the book and what doesn't, and how it will all hang together.
Hmm. That's great. So an audience, right? Who do I want to talk to? Who am I looking to influence here? And then the problem that we want to solve. So the bigger the problem, the better the book, or should we be solving littler problems, Josh?
I wouldn't say that. The problem with big problems is that the solutions tend to be difficult and there tend to be a lot of books. So let's say here's a big problem. People lack confidence. That's a really big problem. How many books do you think there are about how to solve the problem of lacking confidence? There's thousands.
Yeah.
Um, Now, if you want to write about uh, teenage girls that are maturing and they lack confidence, okay, well, now we have a little something that's a little bit more specific. And I'm not going to say a narrow book is an issue. If your book is the definitive book on product management in the manufacturing business, then there may only be 5,000 people who need to read it, but it may be very successful among those 5,000 people. So it has to be the right problem for your audience, and big or small doesn't matter as long as you do a good job of solving that problem.
Hmm. The right problem for your audience. I'm writing
Yeah.
that down because that's brilliant, right? The right problem. So is that's the one that's urgent as well as important, right? That's in maybe in the front of their minds, or does it
Mhm.
have to be something that they're not aware of?
I I think sometimes it's problems that they're not aware of, and sometimes it's problems that they're very aware of. But it should be a problem that nobody has solved yet. I talk about ideas having to have three qualities to be effective in a book, and they need to be big, meaning it occupies a significant amount of sort of mind space in the reader's world. So, if it's product managers, what is something that's a big thing for them? You have to be right in your idea. That is, it would be really good if you had some evidence that your solution actually is going to be effective. And it has to be new. Nobody wants to read the 12th book on the same topic going over the same stuff. And that combination of big and right and new is what allows you to focus in on an idea and a problem worth solving that are actually going to allow you to differentiate. And that's really the key: is the book has to be differentiated from all of the other books out there.
Okay. So big and right and new,
Right.
but there's tons of books like now are you talking just business, like about business, or are you talking leadership as well? Like let's categorize this down,
Yeah.
Josh, so we make sure that we get
Okay.
this.
Okay. So I say business book. In my mind, a business book is any book that business people would want to read. So that
Okay.
can be about management. It could be about leadership. It could be about something technical, like, the best way to take advantage of blockchain. Uh, um, it could even be about becoming more effective as you get older. Uh, Basically, most nonfiction topics fit into that. But my advice doesn't really apply if your book is like, let's take a historical perspective on what happened in the 13th century. Well, that's not a book that business people are going to be particularly interested in. And I got nothing to say to fiction writers. So it's
Yeah.
nonfiction books that solve a problem that I'm looking at.
Okay. Good. I like that. So big meaning big in the space that we're in.
Hmm.
Right, and then new. So with right though, isn't there something to being a contrarian? I mean, how should we attack that? I mean, we talk about being right. I don't know,
Well,
right? Isn't that stirring that up a little bit?
well, as an analyst, I was wrong often. so so the nature of being a technology analyst, and I was an analyst at Forrester Research, is that you are answering questions that are on the leading edge of what people want to know. And these are questions like, will streaming take over the television world? Okay, these are, at the time, that was not an easy question to answer. uh, and it's certainly worth it to be contrarian, but you need evidence. So either if things are far enough along, you get statistics. Okay, I surveyed 150,000 consumers, and this is what they said. Or you have anecdotal evidence. I talked to 5 people in the television industry who were doing this, and this is what they learned. That doesn't make you right, but you have to at least make the case that you're right, because nobody wants to read a book that's like, yeah, well, I don't know, this seems sort of interesting now, because they're going to want to take your advice, and they need at least some sort of evidence that that advice is appropriate and correct.
Okay, so five executives, 150,000 people.
Mhm.
Does it have to be our research? Can it be a just a creative perspective on that, or how does that need to flesh out,
Uh,
Josh?
there's a whole chapter on research in the book, and there are so many sources. First of all, there's primary research. If you can put together surveys or statistics or analysis of data of some kind, that's great. There's a fantastic book called Everybody Lies, which is assembled from startling information gathered from collections of Google searches and evidence about what people do when they visit Pornhub, believe it or not. Um, so, in terms of primary numerical evidence, there's all sorts of it. There's primary research, which is you actually found the people who are doing this. I interviewed 26 people. I'm just saying theoretically, I interviewed 26 people in this space, and here's the story of this guy, and here's the story of this woman,
Hmm.
and here's the story of this company. Okay, that's stuff that people won't have read elsewhere. And then there's secondary research, which is stuff that's already been published. Yeah, you do a web search, you find somebody else's study and quote them. You find what they wrote in a book and you quote that. You find a news story and you write about that. But unless there's some new perspective on that information, people don't generally have a whole lot of interest in a rehash and reassembly of research that is this secondary research that's out there already.
Okay. So we have to spin it in a new way. We have to have new ways of looking at that. That's good. And then you mentioned about research, right? It could be primary or secondary. Is there a number, magic number to be statistically significant, or do we care because we're crafting a story here, Josh?
Ah, well, it really matters who you're trying to talk about. Um, so, and believe me, as a researcher at Forrester, we thought about this all the time. So if you're writing about attitudes among consumers, you probably want to have at least thousands of survey responses. You would never look at a poll for who was people going to vote for president and say, oh, they interviewed 116 people. That that's like that's yes, seems ludicrous, doesn't it? Um, but when you're dealing with business people, um, often you can get useful insight out of uh, 100 or 200 people. And yeah, I have to be careful slicing that data. And you're like, okay, what's the difference between the women in my sample and the men? Okay, now we're really down to something small. The joke we made at Forrester when we sliced things down was I'd say to the statistical people, we'll offer up a prayer to Our Lady of Small Sample Sizes. and, and believe me, if she was granting my request, she probably got pretty sick of it. But if you look at the book I just wrote, I surveyed 242 business authors. Uh, you can learn an awful lot from that collection, even though it's only 242 people. I just today published a piece about how the authors who had hybrid publishers, that is, people that they paid to publish their book, were significantly happier with their publisher than the ones who had traditional publishers that paid them. Um, so that's a conclusion. But if you say, was that different among authors of color versus white authors? You know what? There's not nearly enough sample for me to draw conclusions about something like that.
That makes sense. That makes
Yeah.
sense. So okay, so we got the research piece down. Let's dive into covers, right? Let's dive
Mm,
into book covers. Something you cover at length in there. So what's
mm.
is there a rule? Should I put my face on the cover, Josh? I mean, what's the rule here?
Well, not everyone is as beautiful as you, Phil. So,
Thank God, right?
so, so the 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 first book I was involved with at Forrester by a woman named Mary Modal, she had her picture on the cover, and she was a slender, attractive, a brilliant person, and so that was like sort of interesting. But in general, if you put the person's face on the cover, unless the book is about them, that's questionable. Uh, so that leaves you with a conceptual cover, and you're whether you're dealing with a publisher's graphics people or you're hiring your own graphics people, you want to basically create an emotional brief, which is I want this to be startling, or I want this to be respectable, or I want this to look formal, or I want this to look fun. Um, and talk about some covers that you've seen that you liked and some that you didn't like, and that gives the designer a little bit of space to innovate in there. um, what I try and do is you avoid saying things like um, I would like it to be in yellow and green, or I think everything should be centered, because the designer really is the one with the skill to know what to do about that. And unless you are also a graphic designer, chances are your art direction of that kind is just going to provide them with constraints that aren't really helpful to them.
Yeah. That's good. So I did give design. The only thing I said was,
Mhm.
here's my orange and here's my blue. I'd like you to somehow incorporate these, but the rest
Uh,
is yours for that because I just wanted it to be on brand. Is that okay or is that
oh, of
bad?
course it is. No, that's fine. Um, because that's what you needed for your particular application. Um, I'll also tell you that to get a decent cover, you can hire people on Fiverr, but you're probably looking at $1,500, $2,000 if you're really going to be working with a quality designer. Um,
At a
and
minimum.
that's well, yeah, I
Because
mean,
I talked to the folks that I know design a ton of books. Like, gosh,
yeah,
my brain's escaping me on the
yeah.
name, but they're because they do the cover and the interior. It's like
Mhm.
4 grand.
Wow, was this Face Out Studio by any chance?
Oh
Yeah,
gosh,
no,
I don't
yeah,
remember.
yeah. The interior is usually pretty easy to design unless there's something about your book that's weird. Uh, and Face Out Studio will generally do a cover for $2,500. They're a firm that they've done thousands and thousands of covers. A lot of the big publishers just hire them. So that's you do pretty well with that. Sounds to me like you overpaid, Phil.
Well, that wasn't my book. That was the quote I got.
Okay,
I did not invest that much. So
okay,
I
all
appreciate
right.
that though. That's great. Great to know that on that price range.
Well,
So
that's one thing I want to say is that in my book, I specifically talk about actual numbers because I want
yeah.
people to know what things cost. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the things that I love most about the book.
Mm.
That's why I said the whole book was like, ooh, ah, I got to do that. Okay. That one hurts a little bit, but all right, I'll do
Yeah.
that next book,
Yeah.
So I like that. So, well, I'm in the throes of promoting my own book. So let's wrap this up, Josh, with a little talk about some book promotion here. What are some of the ways that folks can do better at book promotion? How
Mm.
long do we need? Let's start with that, right? What's the time frame?
Okay. So, most important fact about book promotion is that most authors don't do it or don't do it well enough. And it's just absurd to put all that effort into writing a book and then say, oh, people will find it. And no, they won't. They won't find it. It won't go anywhere. So, you want to spend time preparing. You probably there's a time period in almost all book publishing cycles of at least 3 or 4 months when the book is done but it isn't published yet, and instead of being like, oh wow, I'm finally done, no, that's the time you plan your promotion. So I talk about the 5 elements here which you can remember as PQRST. The P and the Q are positioning and question. What's the positioning of the book? This is uh, a strategy book for small business. Okay, that's an example of positioning. The question is, what's the question that it answers? Right? How can small business be effective at positioning? And then the R, S, and T are about how you get the word to spread. R is reach. How are you going to reach as many people as possible? And that generally means tapping all sorts of other people's networks, like I'm doing here with you. The S is the spread. What are you going to give them that will allow it to spread? Are they going to have graphics? Are there going to be blog posts? Is there going to be videos? Something that people will be like, hey, yeah, you should take a look at this. And the T is timing. Timing is important because you want the messages to all hit in the same time frame. If you take, let's just say that you have a typical person that's going to hear about this 5 times because of 5 different things that you've done. If they hear about it 5 times in the space of 2 weeks, they're like, oh my God, Josh's book is everywhere. I got to go look at it. Whereas if that happens over the course of 12 months, they're like, oh, I sort of remember that from before. And it takes 2 or 3 or 4 impressions before they're like, oh, you know what? I'm finally going to go and take a look at this. Oh, it's pretty good. And then they start telling other people about it. So, positioning, question, reach, spread, and timing, those are the 5 things that go into that promotion.
Cool. So, well, your book is great, Josh. I wish I had a physical copy. It'll be here very soon.
Mhm.
Do you have a physical
There you
copy?
go.
Look at
Yes,
that.
they exist.
Beautiful book.
It's out there. Um,
Woohoo.
the ebook is available right now at a reduced price of $8.99 on Amazon. And if you buy directly from my publisher, which you can get access to from my own site, bernoff.com, you can get a copy of the print book now. It won't be available on Amazon until next week. So if people are anxious, now's the time to get it.
Cool. I love that. Great advice here. I'll put that on the ticker here. The book is Build a Better Business Book by Josh Bernoff. If you go to bernoff.com, bernoff.com,
Mm-hmm.
you can get the print book now. You can get the ebook as well. So, Josh, as we wrap this up here, I've got two questions. I'm going to start with one, and that is, why write a business book?
The main reason to write a business book, and I asked people in my survey why they wrote, the main reason that people write was because they wanted to spread the knowledge that they had. Now, there are more practical things like I want people to hire me as a consultant. I want to establish thought leadership. I want to generate leads. I want to get more speaking gigs, paid speaking gigs. But it's mostly about establishing yourself as knowledgeable, and that sharing the knowledge that I had was one of people's main goals among the authors that I surveyed.
Yeah, no better way to get your ideas out there, get them spread than
Mm-hmm.
writing a book, especially a good book, which your book helps people do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Build a better business book. It's not just write it, you got to build it. And the book is a blueprint for
Mm-hmm.
that. So the last question, Josh, obviously they should buy a copy of the book. That's
Mm-hmm.
the first step I would tell people to take. But once you got a copy of the book and you probably are going to skim it the first time and you're going to dive deep,
Mm-hmm.
where do folks get started building that better business book?
Well, you want to start working on the idea, focusing on that audience and the question you answer. And uh, and one thing to look at early is what's the right publishing model. You can pitch traditional publishers, which requires a proposal. You can pay a hybrid publisher, which is expensive but can be effective, or you can self publish, but it makes a difference. That sounds like something that comes at the end, but you want to think about that early on because that'll determine just the type of efforts that you put into your book creation. Oh, and I can't resist saying this. The thing that people always end up behind on is the stories. So, where are you going to get those stories? Talk to your colleagues, talk to your clients, scour the internet, read other books. But unless you've assembled a bunch of interesting stories, it's going to be hard for you to make a book that's worth reading.
So get started assembling those stories, figure out the problem that you're going to solve, the questions that need to be answered, and get a copy of Build a Better Business Book by Josh Bernoff. It's a great book. It's not an easy read, it's a great read. It's a manual. It's something that people should keep right by their desk as they're thinking about writing their business book. So Josh, thanks so much for spending some time with me today and dropping your knowledge. I expect people are going to rush to bernoff.com and get a copy of the print book today. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Phil. It's been great to be here.
Yeah.